The moment people label you useless is the moment your life is about to change, if you make the right decision. Noah Bennett stood under the bright white lights of a small office lobby, his hands slightly shaking as he stared at the form in front of him, unable to move, unable to decide, just like always. And behind him, he could feel the quiet impatience of people waiting, watching, judging without saying a word, because they didn't need to say anything anymore. He had heard it enough times already, from teachers who sighed when he hesitated, from friends who stopped asking for his opinion, from his own father who once looked at him and said, "You never take action, Noah, and that's your biggest problem." And over time those words didn't feel like opinions anymore. They felt like facts, like something written into who he was. And the worst part was not that people called him useless, it was that he had started to believe them. Because every moment in his life seemed to prove it, every missed chance, every second of hesitation, every time he chose to stay quiet instead of stepping forward. It all built a pattern he couldn't break, until that one night, when everything felt heavier than usual, when he sat alone in his small room staring at the ceiling, replaying the same thought over and over again. What's wrong with me? And for the first time, instead of feeling sorry for himself, he felt something different, something sharper, clearer, almost uncomfortable, like a truth he had been avoiding his entire life. Because deep down he knew it wasn't that he was incapable, it wasn't that he lacked intelligence or strength or opportunity. It was something much simpler and much harder to admit. He had never truly made a decision, not a real one, not the kind that forces you to act no matter what you feel. And as that realization settled in, something shifted inside him, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a switch turning on in a dark room. And in that moment Noah didn't promise to change his entire life. He didn't imagine success or prove anyone wrong. He only made one small decision, a decision so simple that no one else would have noticed it. But for him it was different, because for the first time, he chose action over hesitation, and he didn't know it yet. But that single choice was about to rewrite everything people thought they knew about him. The next morning, nothing around Noah looked different. The same streets, the same gray sidewalks, the same quiet pressure sitting on his shoulders. But inside him something had shifted, and for the first time in years he did not wait for the feeling of confidence to arrive before taking action. He simply moved, and that was new, that was unfamiliar, and honestly, that was uncomfortable, because every step he took felt unnatural, like he was acting against his own instincts. When he reached the office again and saw the same front desk, the same clipboard, and the same kind of people walking in with confidence he did not have, his mind tried to pull him back into the old pattern, telling him to pause, to think more, to wait until he was ready. But this time he did not listen. He picked up the pen and filled out the form immediately. No hesitation, no second guessing, just action. And it was not perfect. His handwriting was slightly messy. He skipped one line and had to go back. But for the first time, he finished something without freezing. And that small moment did not change how others saw him. No one clapped. No one noticed. But it changed something much more important. It gave him proof. Proof that he could act even when he felt unsure. And that proof stayed with him throughout the day. When his manager asked a question during a short team meeting, Noah felt the same pressure building up, the same fear of saying something wrong. But instead of staying silent like always, he spoke. His voice was not strong. It was not confident. And he stumbled slightly over his words, but he did not stop. And that was enough. The room did not react much. The meeting continued as usual. But inside Noah, that moment felt bigger than anything else, because it was another break in the pattern that had controlled him for years. And as the hours passed, he began to notice something interesting. Action was not as impossible as he once believed. It was just unfamiliar, like a muscle he had never used. Weak at first, but capable of growing. And the more he used it, the less power hesitation had over him. That evening, when he walked home under the soft orange glow of the streetlights, he replayed the day in his mind, not with regret like he always used to, but with a quiet sense of progress, small, almost invisible progress, but real. And for the first time, the word useless did not echo as loudly in his head. It was still there, but it was fading, slowly being replaced by something else, something new, a question that had never crossed his mind before. What if I am not useless? What if I just never trained myself to decide? And that thought stayed with him as he reached his door, because deep down he could feel it. This was only the beginning, and if one small decision could change a single day, then maybe, just maybe, it could change everything. The following days did not bring a sudden transformation, and that was the part Noah had to learn to accept, because nothing around him changed overnight. People still spoke to him the same way, still overlooked him in conversations, still assumed he would hesitate before doing anything important, and at first, that almost pulled him back into his old mindset, because a part of him expected immediate results, expected that one decision would instantly prove everyone wrong, but instead, all he had were small moments, quiet actions that no one seemed to notice, like replying to an email without overthinking every word, like raising his hand during a meeting even when his heart was beating faster than usual, like finishing tasks without waiting for the perfect moment. And each of these actions felt simple on the outside but required effort on the inside, because every time he chose to act, he had to push against years of hesitation, years of doubt that whispered to him to slow down, to wait, to stay safe. But he did not stop, not because he suddenly felt confident, but because he had made a decision to act regardless of how he felt. And that distinction began to change everything, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until one afternoon, something different happened. During a team discussion, his manager asked a question that no one answered right away. The room went silent, and for a brief moment, Noah felt that familiar pressure return, the same weight that used to freeze him. But this time, instead of retreating, he leaned into it. He spoke up, not perfectly, not with certainty, but clearly enough to be heard. And for the first time, someone responded directly to him, not with doubt, not with dismissal, but with consideration. And that moment stayed with him long after the meeting ended. Because it was not about what he said, it was about what he did. He stepped forward when his instinct told him to step back, and that created a small shift in how others saw him. But more importantly, it created a bigger shift in how he saw himself, because he was starting to realize that the label he had carried for so long was not permanent. It was a pattern, and patterns could be broken, not in one dramatic moment, but through repeated decisions. And that realization changed the way he approached each day. Instead of asking himself if he was capable, he began asking a different question. What is the next action I can take right now? And that question became his anchor, something simple he could return to whenever doubt tried to take over. And as the days turned into a week, the changes began to stack, small at first, but undeniable, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. And even though no one said it out loud, something about Noah was different now. Not louder, not more aggressive, but more present, more engaged, and for the first time, he was no longer invisible, and deep inside, he could feel it. This was no longer just about proving others wrong. This was about becoming someone he had never allowed himself to be before, someone who decides, and then moves, no matter what. As the second week began, Noah noticed something he had never paid attention to before, not in the world around him, but inside his own mind. Because even though he had started to act more, the old voice had not disappeared. It was still there, still whispering the same doubts at the worst possible moments, telling him to slow down, to be careful, to avoid mistakes, and for a brief moment each time, he felt the pull to go back to who he used to be. Because hesitation was familiar, hesitation felt safe. But now there was something else inside him as well, something new that pushed back. A quieter but stronger thought that asked him one simple question. What happens if you act anyway? And that question became the line between his past and his future, because every time he faced it, he had to choose, not once, but over and over again. And at first, those choices were exhausting, because deciding again and again required effort, required awareness, required him to stay present instead of drifting back into habit. But slowly, something began to change. The effort started to feel lighter, the decisions came faster, and what once felt forced began to feel natural, until one afternoon when an unexpected situation put everything to the test. His manager approached him with a task that was slightly outside his usual responsibilities, something that required initiative, planning, and communication, and before, Noah would have immediately doubted himself. He would have hesitated, overanalyzed, or even avoided the opportunity entirely. But this time, the moment felt different, not easier, but clearer, because he recognized it for what it was, not just a task, but a turning point, a chance to either reinforce his new pattern or fall back into the old one. And without waiting for confidence, without waiting to feel ready, he said yes. And as soon as the word left his mouth, he felt a brief wave of uncertainty, but it did not stop him, because he had already made the decision, and now all that remained was action. Over the next few days, he worked through the task step by step, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but consistently, asking questions when needed, making adjustments when things did not go as planned, and most importantly, continuing forward instead of stopping. And something surprising began to happen. People started responding to him differently, not because he had suddenly become exceptional, but because he was no longer invisible. He was showing up, contributing, taking ownership, and those small shifts began to change the way others interacted with him. And for the first time, he saw something in their reactions that he had never seen before. Not doubt, not dismissal, but recognition. And that recognition did not come from talent or luck. It came from one simple pattern repeated enough times, the pattern of deciding and then acting. And as he stood there at the end of the week, looking at the completed task, he realized something that felt almost unreal. The person he had been trying to become was not built through one big moment. It was built through every small decision he chose not to avoid. And deep down, he could feel it more clearly than ever before. This was no longer temporary. This was who he was becoming. By the third week, something subtle but powerful had begun to take shape in Noah's life. Not something dramatic that others could easily point out, but something deeper, something structural, because his days no longer felt random or reactive. They started to follow a pattern, and that pattern was built on one simple rule he had unknowingly created for himself. Decide first, adjust later. And at first, this rule felt risky, almost reckless compared to how he used to live, where he would analyze every possible outcome before taking even the smallest step. But now he was learning something new, that clarity does not come before action. It comes from action. And this realization began to change the way he approached not only work, but every part of his life. When he woke up in the morning, he no longer stayed in bed debating whether to get up. He simply stood up. When he faced a task, he no longer waited for the perfect plan. He started with what he had. And as simple as these actions seemed, they created a momentum he had never experienced before, because each decision removed a layer of hesitation, and each action built a small amount of confidence. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that grows through repetition. And as this momentum increased, so did the expectations around him. His manager began assigning him slightly more complex responsibilities, tasks that required coordination, follow-up, and independent thinking. And for a moment, the old fear tried to return, telling him that he was not ready, that he would make mistakes, that he would prove everyone right about him. But now, Noah saw that voice for what it was, not truth, but habit. And instead of listening to it, he leaned into his new pattern. He accepted the tasks, broke them down into smaller steps, and moved forward one decision at a time. And yes, there were mistakes, small ones, things he overlooked, moments where he had to correct himself. But unlike before, those mistakes did not stop him. They guided him, they showed him what to adjust, and that shift in perspective made all the difference. Because he was no longer trying to avoid failure, he was using it as feedback. And as the days passed, the results became harder to ignore, deadlines were met, communication improved, and the quality of his work steadily increased. And the most surprising part was not how others reacted, although they did begin to trust him more. It was how he reacted to himself, because for the first time, he felt a sense of control over his own actions, a sense that his life was not something that happened to him, but something he could actively shape. And that realization brought a new kind of energy into his routine, not excitement, not pressure, but focus, a steady and grounded focus that kept him moving forward. And one evening, as he sat at his desk reviewing what he had accomplished over the past few weeks, he paused, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because he could clearly see the contrast between who he had been and who he was becoming. And it was not talent that created that gap. It was not luck or opportunity. It was the accumulation of decisions, small, consistent, and intentional. And as he leaned back in his chair, a quiet thought crossed his mind, one that felt both simple and powerful. If this is what a few weeks of real decisions can do, then what could happen if I keep going? And for the first time, That question did not scare him, it motivated him. As the fourth week began, Noah stepped into the office with a different presence, not louder, not more confident in the way people usually imagine, but more certain in his actions, and that difference started to attract attention in ways he did not expect, because now when tasks were assigned, his name came up more often, not because he was the most skilled, but because he had become reliable, and reliability, he realized, was built on something very simple, the ability to decide and follow through. And for a while, everything seemed to move forward smoothly, until one morning when a larger responsibility landed on his desk, something that was not just another task, but a project that required him to lead, to organize, and to make decisions that would affect others. And as he looked at the details, he felt that old pressure returned stronger than before, because this was different. This was not just about acting quickly. This was about making the right choices. And for a moment, the familiar doubt resurfaced, telling him that he was not ready for something at this level, that he would fail, that he would expose himself as the same person everyone once believed him to be. And this time, the voice felt louder, more convincing, because the stakes were higher. And for the first time since he began changing, Noah paused longer than usual, standing there with the weight of the decision pressing down on him. And in that moment, he realized something important. Progress does not remove fear. It reveals new levels of it. And the only way forward was the same as before, not to eliminate the fear, but to decide in spite of it. And slowly, he took a breath and made his choice. He accepted the responsibility, not because he felt ready, but because he had learned that readiness comes after action, not before it. And as the days unfolded, the challenge pushed him further than anything he had experienced so far. He had to communicate clearly, manage time carefully, and handle unexpected problems without retreating into hesitation. And yes, there were moments where things did not go as planned, moments where he had to adjust, rethink, and even admit that he did not have all the answers. But instead of freezing, he kept moving, decision after decision, step by step, and something remarkable began to happen. Not only did the project start to come together, but the people around him began to respond differently. They started asking for his input, trusting his direction, and relying on him to move things forward. And that shift was not loud or dramatic, but it was real, and Noah could feel it, not just in how others treated him, but in how he carried himself, because now, when he looked at a challenge, he did not see a reason to hesitate. He saw an opportunity to decide, and that mindset transformed the way he experienced pressure. It no longer felt like something to avoid. It became something to move through. And as the project reached its final stages, Noah stood back for a moment, not to question himself, but to observe the path he had taken, and he could clearly see it now. Every step, every decision, every moment where he chose action over doubt, all leading to this point. And for the first time, he understood something that had been hidden from him his entire life. Confidence is not something you wait for. It is something you build, one decision at a time. As the final day of the project approached, the atmosphere in the office felt different, not because of any major announcement or visible change, but because there was a quiet sense of anticipation in the air, and Noah could feel it as he reviewed the last details, checking timelines, confirming tasks, and making sure everything was aligned. And even though the work was nearly complete, this was the moment that mattered most, because this was where everything would either come together or fall apart. And as he stood there, looking at the results of weeks of consistent decisions, he felt something he had not expected, not fear, not doubt, but a calm awareness, the kind that comes from knowing you have done the work. And still, a small part of him wondered how others would see it, whether they would notice the effort, whether they would recognize the change. But this time, that question did not control him, because he had already learned something more important, that his value was not defined by a single outcome, but by the pattern he had built. And as the team gathered to review the project, his manager began going through each section, pointing out what worked, what could be improved, and how the overall execution came together. And for a moment, Noah simply listened, not trying to predict the reaction, not preparing to defend himself, just present, just aware. And then something happened that caught him off guard. His manager paused and mentioned his name, not in the way people used to, not with hesitation or doubt, but with clear acknowledgement, highlighting the consistency, the initiative, and the way he handled responsibility under pressure. And as those words settled in, Noah did not react outwardly. He did not interrupt or draw attention to himself. But inside, something shifted, something deeper than pride. Because this was not about being praised, it was about seeing proof that change was real, that the version of himself he had been building was now visible to others. And as the meeting ended and people began to move on with their day, a few of his coworkers stopped to speak with him, asking questions, sharing thoughts, including him in conversations in a way they never had before. And it was in those small interactions that the transformation became undeniable, not because he had suddenly become someone extraordinary, but because he had become someone who acts, someone who decides, someone who moves forward even when things are uncertain. And later that evening, as he walked out of the building and into the quiet street, the city lights reflecting softly on the pavement, he paused for a moment, not out of hesitation, but reflection, because he could clearly remember the version of himself who once stood still, who once waited, who once believed he was incapable, and now, standing in the same world, surrounded by the same environment, he realized something that changed everything. Nothing outside of him had truly changed. The only thing that changed was the way he responded, the way he chose, the way he acted, and that realization stayed with him as he continued walking. Because deep down, he understood something most people never fully grasp, that becoming someone new does not require a perfect plan or a perfect moment. It requires one decision, made again and again until it becomes who you are. In the days that followed, something even more unexpected began to happen, not around Noah, but because of him, because the same people who once overlooked him were now quietly adjusting the way they behaved. They started to ask for his opinion before making small decisions. They included him in discussions where he used to sit silently. And sometimes they even waited for his response. And at first, Noah noticed this with a sense of surprise, almost disbelief, because it felt unfamiliar to be seen in that way. But instead of overthinking it like he once would have, he stayed with his new pattern. He listened, he decided, and he responded, not perfectly, but consistently. And with each interaction, something deeper was being reinforced, not just in how others viewed him, but in how he defined himself. Because the identity he had carried for so long was slowly being replaced, not by words or labels, but by actions repeated enough times to become truth. And one afternoon, as he sat at his desk reviewing a new set of tasks, a coworker approached him with a question, a simple one. But the tone was different. It carried trust, the kind of trust that is not given lightly. And as Noah answered, he realized something that made him pause for just a moment. This was not the same situation anymore. This was not someone testing him or doubting him. This was someone relying on him. And that shift revealed something important. People do not decide who you are based on what you say. They decide based on what you consistently do. And for the first time, Noah could clearly see that his actions had begun to rewrite the story others believed about him. And later that evening, as he walked home through the familiar streets, he reflected on how subtle the transformation had been. There was no single moment where everything changed, no dramatic turning point that everyone could point to. Instead, it was a series of small decisions, each one building on the last, each one strengthening a pattern that had once felt impossible to break. And as he thought about it, he realized that the word useless had never truly described his ability. It had only described his pattern, a pattern of hesitation, of delay, of waiting for the right moment that never came. And once that pattern changed, everything else began to follow. And this realization brought a quiet sense of clarity, because it removed the mystery from his growth. It showed him that change was not something reserved for a few people. It was something available to anyone willing to decide and act. And as he reached his door and paused for a brief moment, he understood something that felt both simple and powerful. The difference between who he was and who he had become was not talent, not luck, not even opportunity. It was the willingness to make a decision and stand by it, again and again, even when it felt uncomfortable, even when it felt uncertain. And as that thought settled in, he felt a sense of direction that he had never experienced before, not because he knew exactly what would happen next, but because he finally trusted the process that would take him there. Weeks turned into months, and what once felt like a fragile change in Noah's life had now become something steady, something real, something that no longer required constant effort to maintain. because the pattern he had built through repeated decisions had slowly become his default way of living, and the hesitation that once controlled him had lost its power, not completely, but enough that it no longer defined his actions. And as he moved through his days, taking on new challenges, handling responsibilities, and continuing to grow, he began to notice something deeper than external progress, something that had nothing to do with work or recognition. It was the way he saw himself, because for the first time, he no longer questioned whether he was capable. He no longer measured his worth by how others labeled him. Instead, he trusted his ability to decide and move forward, and that trust changed everything. Not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a quiet and consistent way that shaped every choice he made. And one evening, as he sat alone reflecting on how far he had come, he remembered the version of himself who once stood frozen in that same office lobby, unable to take even the smallest step, and he realized something that most people never fully understand, that the difference between who he was and who he had become was not time, it was not luck, and it was not some hidden talent waiting to be discovered. It was a single principle applied over and over again, the willingness to decide without waiting for certainty. And as that realization settled in, it became clear to him that this principle was not limited to one part of his life. It was something that could be applied anywhere, to any goal, any challenge, any situation, because every path forward begins the same way, with a decision. And the more he thought about it, the more he understood why so many people remain stuck, not because they lack ability, but because they remain in a constant state of waiting for the right time, waiting for confidence, waiting for clarity, not realizing that those things are created through action, not before it. And as Noah stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet city lights stretching across the distance, he felt a sense of calm that he had never experienced before, not because everything was perfect, but because he no longer needed it to be. He had learned how to move forward regardless, and that ability gave him something far more valuable than certainty. It gave him direction, and in that moment, he understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. You do not become someone new by waiting to feel ready. You become someone new the moment you decide to act, and you continue becoming that person every time you choose to move forward, no matter how small the step may seem.